So when I started writing fantasy, I was tired of European medieval structures of stories. So I went to the mythology of Greece, which I loved. But as I dug in, I realized I wanted to get back behind the classical era and found the earlier earth goddess traditions that were there even in the Greek mainland, especially before the cities kind of took over. And so that became really central to my first two novels. But I also then started to seek out non-European fantasy to read. I discovered The Ghost Bride by Yangsze Choo. She's Malaysian Chinese. And here I discovered that while European mythology has ghosts haunt places, Chinese and some other Eastern thought has ghosts haunt people. And that changes the dynamics a lot. I found some of those same concepts in more literary fiction, but The Ghost Bride is now a Netflix series produced in Taiwan. So I have to go check that out with subtitles. I came across Tasha Suri, who writes powerful stories set in Mughal India, and her magic system is based on symbolic dance. And there are lots of jinns in her story. Very, very different world than the kind of epic fantasy that I grew up with. There are lots of good stories that also draw on Islamic cultural backgrounds. There's a good, though rather histrionic, Canadian story called Beneath the Rising by Premee Mohamed, quite a new story. But one has to go to Who Fears Death by Nnendi Okorafor, because it's a post-apocalyptic North Africa where the book is really central to how the story works out. And we are reminded of the role of the book. And often so the stories that draw on Islam also help us to remember the diversity of Islam, exposing us to stuff that we don't think of it. We just look at the kind of politics of our interactions these days. So why do authors write this kind of story? The author of Rage of Dragons, Evan Winter, says that he wrote a book based on African peoples and African spirituality and culture because he'd never read an epic fantasy with people who looked like him. And he wanted his kids to have a different experience. It was after his first child was born that he started to write fantasy. And The Rage of Dragons is the first book in a series which will be ongoing. In the last couple of years, I've discovered Indigenous futurism. We've probably heard of Cherie Dimaline, the author of the Marrow Thieves, which got a lot of attention. She also wrote The Empire of Wild. They're strong Indigenous characters, and they're stories that uncover the ideology and damage of settler colonialism, and give a look inside her Métis people, mostly, as she experiences that culture and that community. The second book especially, the first book really seems like taking aim at my European white culture. The second one, I think, is also a bit of a cautionary tale for her own Métis people as well. And why read the books? Well, they're a place that we get to look into another world and look into another culture. We get to look at European-rooted ideas from a different perspective and get a look into someone else's view of the world. In an argument with a white vampire, Darcie Little Badger has a woman banish the vampire from her land, claiming she's Apache, this is Apache land, and he's a white vampire. So if you want to live, she says, fly north as far as you can, because we had a lot of territory and you won't live until you get beyond it. It's a really, it's a nice incident in the story, but it also reminds us of relationship to land. And becoming relationship to land, as Laura mentioned, is just so important. And it's one that settler society has to get a good feeling for if we're ever going to figure out treaties and new relationships with Indigenous peoples across this place now called Canada. The Little Badger also pointed out that in an interview with, it was a CBC interview, and I forget whether it was, anyway, I forget which program it was. But she said that the stories are a place where we get to show connection to tradition and the continuity of culture, and where my people, she says, get to show the resilience of our culture. It's still here with us and it ain't going nowhere. So people are using stories and speculative fiction in order to explore their own tradition in ways that are really informative. And so that's why everybody needs to read diverse fiction, and diverse speculative fiction in particular. They remind us that diverse cultures are alive and growing into the future, not just a historic past. And I also believe that taking apart the structures that support racism and inequality also means taking apart the ideologies that support them and learning to respect other people's ideology and mythology, other people's thought patterns. Reading speculative fiction is a place we get to do that, because decolonize our thinking and then decolonizing our society will get to be at least a little easier.